The history of Japan, as most people understand it, begins with the Yayoi, the rice farmers who arrived from the Asian mainland roughly 2,000 years ago, bringing with them the agricultural system, the bronze and iron technology, and the social organization that would eventually produce the Japan of samurai and Shinto shrines and imperial dynasties. The Yayoi are the recognizable ancestors of the culture that the world identifies as Japanese. Their arrival is when the story in the popular telling effectively starts. But there was a people in Japan before the Yayoi, a people who had been there for an almost incomprehensible span of time, who had been living on the Japanese archipelago for at least 14,000 years, possibly much longer, building one of the most distinctive, and in certain respects, one of the most sophisticated hunter-gatherer cultures in the prehistoric world. They are called the Jomon, named for the cord-impressed pottery they made, pottery that is among the oldest in the world. And what the ancient DNA has revealed about the Jomon, about what happened when the Yayoi arrived, and about who the modern Japanese actually are at the genomic level, is a story that has transformed the understanding of Japanese origins, and that carries implications for Japanese national identity that are still being worked out. The Jomon people first appear in the archaeological record of Japan around 14,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Holocene, the geological epoch that followed the last ice age. Their pottery, which predates agriculture and appears to have been used for storing and cooking wild foods, is among the earliest ceramic production documented anywhere in the world. This alone marks the Jomon as culturally remarkable. Pottery is typically associated with settled agricultural societies, with the need to store grain and process domesticated plant foods. The Jomon made pottery as hunter-gatherers, suggesting a level of sedentism and food storage complexity that challenges the simple equation of pottery with farming. Over the 12,000 years of Jomon culture, from roughly 14,000 BCE to roughly 300 BCE, the archaeological record shows a society of considerable sophistication. The Jomon built permanent settlements, some of which were occupied continuously for generations. They developed elaborate ritual practices, including complex burial traditions, and the production of clay figurines called dogu, abstract human-like forms whose specific ritual meaning is unknown, but whose consistent appearance across wide geographic areas and long time spans suggest shared symbolic systems. They managed marine and forest resources with a knowledge and intentionality that allowed large communities to sustain themselves without agriculture in a richly productive island environment. The Japanese archipelago, with its diverse coastal environments, its abundant salmon runs, its rich shellfish beds, its forests full of deer and wild boar, and edible plants, provided a food base that allowed the Jomon to be settled and complex without the agricultural transformation that most other regions of the world required for the same level of social organization. The Jomon were not simpler than farming societies. They were a different kind of complex society, adapted to the particular abundance of their island home. And then the Yayoi arrived. The Yayoi expansion into Japan, beginning roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago and proceeding over several centuries, introduced wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron metallurgy, and a significantly different material culture and social organization. The Yayoi are generally understood to have originated from populations in the Korean peninsula and mainland China, carrying with them the agricultural package that had been transforming East Asia for thousands of years. Their arrival in Japan was not a single event, but a gradual process of migration and demographic expansion that proceeded from the southwestern islands northward across the main islands. For most of the 20th century, the relationship between the Jomon and the Yayoi was understood through a transformation model. The incoming Yayoi brought agriculture, and the Jomon adopted it, gradually becoming what we now recognize as the Japanese people. In this model, the modern Japanese were primarily descended from the Jomon, with the Yayoi contribution being primarily cultural and technological rather than demographic. The Japanese were, in this telling, the Jomon people who had learned to farm. The ancient DNA dismantled this model with precision. The results that emerged from a series of studies beginning in the 2010s and culminating in increasingly comprehensive analyses in the early 2020s showed that the relationship between Jomon and Yayoi was not primarily a story of cultural transformation. It was a story of demographic replacement and admixture, with the Yayoi migrants contributing the majority of the ancestry of modern Japanese people. and the Jomon contributing a significant but minority component that varies across different Japanese populations. The most comprehensive ancient DNA study of Japanese population history, published in 2021 in the journal Science Advances, estimated that modern mainland Japanese carry approximately 10 to 20% Jomon ancestry, with the remainder deriving from the Yayoi and subsequent East Asian migrations. This proportion is not trivial. 10 to 20% represents a meaningful biological connection to the people who inhabited the archipelago for 12,000 years before the Yayoi arrived. But it also means that modern Japanese are predominantly, in the genomic sense, not the descendants of the Jomon. They are the descendants of the migrants who came after. The implications of this finding for Japanese national and cultural identity are significant, and the reception of the ancient DNA research in Japan reflects the complexity of engaging with genomic findings that intersect with deeply held beliefs about ethnic and national continuity. Japanese identity has long been understood both within Japan and internationally through the concept of a homogeneous population with deep roots in the archipelago. The Jomon in this framing were the original Japanese, and their cultural legacy, however transformed by the Yayoi agricultural revolution, ran continuously through Japanese civilization to the present. The ancient DNA complicates this picture in two directions simultaneously. On one hand, it confirms that the Jomon were genetically distinct, a population with deep roots in the archipelago, and a genetic profile that shows clear differences from the mainland East Asian populations that would eventually produce the Yayoi migrants. The Jomon were genuinely ancient inhabitants of Japan, not recent arrivals from the continent. In this sense, the deep human history of the Japanese archipelago is real. On the other hand, the genetic evidence shows that modern Japanese are predominantly descended from people who arrived from the continent in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, not from the 12,000-year Jomon tradition. The cultural and biological continuity between the Jomon and modern Japanese is real but partial. The Jomon are in modern Japanese people, but they are a minority of who modern Japanese people are. The population that preserves the highest proportion of Jomon ancestry among any living Japanese group is not the mainland Japanese, but the Ainu, the indigenous people of Hokkaido and the northern islands, whom we have explored in a previous episode of this series. The Ainu carry approximately 60 to 70% Jomon ancestry, compared to 10 to 20% in mainland Japanese. The Ainu are, in the most direct genomic sense, the closest living relatives of the Jomon. They are the people who most directly continue the genetic legacy of Japan's original inhabitants. This creates a picture of Japanese prehistory that is more complicated and more interesting than either the pure Jomon origin model or the simple Yayoi replacement model had predicted. The Yayoi migration was substantial. It introduced the majority of the ancestry of modern Japanese people, but it did not erase the Jomon entirely. The Jomon ancestry that survived in the modern Japanese genome represents the biological trace of 12,000 years of human presence in the archipelago, compressed into a 10 to 20% component that is now distributed across the genomes of more than 100 million people. And the Jomon ancestry is not randomly distributed. It is higher in certain geographic regions of Japan, particularly in the northeast of the main island, and in Okinawa, where the Yayoi demographic expansion proceeded more slowly and mixed more extensively with the existing Jomon population. It is lower in the southwest, the first zone of Yayoi settlement, where the incoming population was most demographically dense, and where the replacement of Jomon ancestry was most complete. This geographic gradient is itself a record of the Yayoi expansion. It shows, in the bodies of living Japanese people, the direction and the speed of the demographic transformation that occurred 2,000 years ago. The population history of Japan is written in the regional variation of Jomon ancestry across the modern Japanese genome, visible only when you know how to read it. Consider what the Jomon actually were, before the arrival changed everything. They were a people who had been in one place for longer than most human populations have existed anywhere. 14,000 years on a series of islands is an extraordinary span of continuous presence. In that time, they developed a relationship with the Japanese landscape, the salmon rivers and the shellfish beds and the deer trails and the forest plants. That was the product of hundreds of generations of accumulated knowledge. They built communities. They made art. They buried their dead with care. They looked up at the same mountains that modern Japanese look at from the windows of the bullet train, and those mountains were already theirs. When the Yayoi arrived, the Jomon did not simply disappear. They mixed, in varying proportions, with the incoming population. Their genes entered the Yayoi-derived population and have persisted there for 2,000 years. The modern Japanese person who carries 15% Jomon ancestry is carrying, in that 15%, a molecular connection to people who were looking at Mount Fuji 10,000 years before anyone in the world had heard of rice. That connection is not the whole story of who the Japanese are, but it is a part of the story that was invisible before the ancient DNA made it legible, and it changes the question of Japanese origins from a simple story of arrival and transformation into something more layered, more continuous, and more honest about the depth of the human presence that preceded the civilization that the world recognizes as Japan. The Jomon were never what we thought, not because they were unknown, but because what we thought about them was a beginning without an ending, a people whose story the textbooks closed when the Yayoi arrived. The DNA shows that the story did not close. It continued, diluted and mixed but unbroken, into the bodies of the people who now inhabit the same islands the Jomon called home for 12,000 years. They are still there, in the molecule, still part of Japan. The Yayoi changed everything. The Jomon survived anyway. There is one more dimension to the Jomon story that the ancient DNA has illuminated, one that concerns not the Japanese mainland, but the broader question of who the Jomon were before they became Japanese. The genomic profile of the Jomon is distinctive, not just in relation to modern Japanese people, but in relation to the broader family of East Asian populations. The Jomon show a deep divergence from the continental East Asian populations that produced the Yayoi, a divergence that suggests the ancestors of the Jomon separated from the populations of mainland East Asia a very long time ago, possibly during or before the last glacial maximum, when the Japanese archipelago was connected to the mainland by land bridges and then separated as sea levels rose. The Jomon may be the descendants of one of the earliest waves of modern human expansion into East Asia, a population that reached the Japanese archipelago early and then developed in relative isolation for thousands of years, while the rest of East Asia was being transformed by subsequent migrations and admixtures. If so, they are not simply the pre-agricultural inhabitants of Japan. They are a window into the deepest layer of East Asian human prehistory, a population that preserves genetic information about the early settlement of the eastern part of the world that no other living population has maintained so completely. In the bodies of the Ainu, who carry 60 to 70% Jomon ancestry, and in the smaller proportion that persists in mainland Japanese, the oldest human story of the Japanese archipelago is still being told. The bullet train passes Mount Fuji. The Shinkansen runs above the river valleys where Jomon people caught salmon for 12,000 years, and in the cells of the people in those trains, a fraction of the genome traces back to the people who were there first. Not a large fraction, but a real one, and in the deep time of human prehistory, real is enough.